My name is Lorraine Thompson, 56 years old, and I never thought my own daughter would betray me over a car. My 1967 Mustang was the last gift from my father. I spent years restoring it with my own hands after working long days as a teacher. When Tiffany demanded I sell it to fund her extravagant wedding, I stood my ground. She blocked me completely, then suddenly invited me to dinner 2 weeks later. I walked into that restaurant expecting reconciliation, only to find her sitting with two lawyers and my manipulative ex-husband. Where are you watching from today? If you've ever had to choose between your boundaries and a loved one's demands, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't believe what happened when those lawyers slid the papers across the table. I grew up with the smell of motor oil and the sound of wrenches clinking against metal. My father, Jack, owned a small auto repair shop in rural Michigan, and from the time I could toddle around, I was his shadow. While other little girls received dolls for their birthdays, I got my first tool set at age 7. Dad never had sons, but he didn't need any. He had me, and he made sure I knew that was more than enough. "Laurie," he'd say, wiping grease from his hands. "Knowing how to fix things gives you freedom. Never forget that." By 16, I could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded and diagnose engine problems just by listening. The neighborhood boys brought their cars to me before big dates, knowing I'd make sure they wouldn't break down. Our garage was my classroom, my sanctuary, and where I felt most connected to my father. Dad's pride and joy was his 1967 Mustang Fastback, candy apple red with black interior. He'd bought it used in 1970 and kept it immaculate. On weekends, we'd take drives through the countryside windows down, singing along to his old Motown records. Someday, he'd promise, "This beauty will be yours." I met Richard Wainwright during my sophomore year of college. He was studying business administration, wore expensive clothes, and drove a brand new BMW. He was nothing like the boys I'd grown up with their calloused hands and modest dreams. Richard had plans, big ones, and his confidence was intoxicating. When he asked me out, I was surprised and flattered. When he kept asking, I was smitten. He seemed fascinated by my mechanical knowledge, calling it charmingly unique. Looking back, I should have recognized the condescension in his tone, but I was young and in love with the idea of being loved. We married 3 months after graduation. I had dreams of opening my own garage someday, but Richard convinced me to pursue teaching instead. More stable, he said. More appropriate is what he meant. So I became a middle school science teacher while he climbed the corporate ladder at his father's investment firm. When Tiffany was born 2 years later, my world shifted entirely. She was perfect. Richard's striking blue eyes. My curly hair, 10 tiny fingers that gripped mine with surprising strength. I fell in love instantly, completely. The first few years were happy ones. Richard was a doting father who proudly showed off his beautiful wife and daughter at company functions. We moved into a sprawling house in an exclusive neighborhood, and from the outside our life looked picture perfect. The cracks appeared gradually. First, it was small criticisms about my appearance or how I kept the house. Then control over our finances. Richard insisted I didn't have a head for money and limited my access to our accounts. When I objected, he'd remind me how fortunate I was that he provided so well for us. The emotional manipulation was so subtle, I barely recognized it happening. By the time Tiffany was 7, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The vibrant, capable woman who could rebuild engines had been replaced by someone who apologized constantly and walked on eggshells in her own home. When I finally gathered the courage to suggest marriage counseling, Richard's mask slipped completely. "There's nothing wrong with me," he'd sneered. "You're the problem. Always have been." The divorce was ugly. Richard had money connections and a ruthless attorney. I had my teacher's salary and a father whose health was failing due to Parkinson's disease. Richard painted me as emotionally unstable, using my occasional visits to my therapist against me. He convinced the judge that Tiffany would be better off spending most of her time in his stable environment rather than with me in the small apartment I could barely afford. I got custody every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. Richard got to shape our daughter's worldview the other 25 days of the month. The years that followed were an exercise in endurance. I worked my teaching job during the day and picked up tutoring gigs in the evenings to make ends meet. Every spare penny went toward creating a welcoming space for Tiffany's visits and saving for her future education. Meanwhile, Richard took her on lavish vacations, bought her designer clothes, and subtly undermined me at every turn. "Mom's apartment is so cozy," 8-year-old Tiffany once said, using Richard's exact intonation. My father's health deteriorated rapidly after the divorce. It seemed like the stress of seeing me go through such pain accelerated his decline. When he passed away 3 years later, I was devastated. At the reading of his will through my tears, I learned he had left me the Mustang, his most prized possession. That car became my lifeline during the darkest period of my life. On weekends when Tiffany was with Richard, I'd spend hours in my apartment complex parking garage, methodically restoring the Mustang that had fallen into disrepair during Dad's illness. Each part I fixed felt like healing a piece of myself. The neighbors thought I was crazy, a middle-aged woman in grease-stained clothes working on an old car until midnight. But for the first time since the divorce, I felt like myself again. As Tiffany entered her teenage years, our relationship became increasingly strained. The material gap between her two homes grew more apparent to her. With Richard, she had her own wing in his mansion, a closet full of luxury brands and vacation photos that looked like magazine spreads. With me, she had a modest bedroom in a 2-bedroom apartment and weekend activities that required budgeting. "Why can't we ever eat at nice restaurants?" she'd ask. "Why don't you buy new furniture?" she'd complain. The implicit comparison to Richard's lifestyle was always there, though I never disparaged him in front of her. I believed that eventually she'd see through the materialism to the emotional manipulation underneath. I was her mother, after all. Our bond had to be stronger than money. By the time Tiffany left for college, a prestigious private university, Richard paid for, of course, she had adopted many of his values and mannerisms. Her calls became less frequent, her visits home shorter. Still, I held on to hope that as she matured, she'd develop a more balanced perspective. That hope sustained me through the lonely years. I poured myself into my teaching, mentoring struggling students who reminded me of my younger self. And every weekend, rain or shine, I worked on that Mustang until it gleamed like it had in my childhood memories. What I didn't realize was how completely Richard's influence had shaped Tiffany's understanding of love, worth, and family. I was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. Tiffany met Bradley Harrington during her senior year of college. He came from a family almost as wealthy as Richard's, with old money connections that even my ex-husband envied. When Tiffany brought him to meet me, I was struck by how nervous she seemed. Not about whether I would like him, but whether he would find me acceptable. "This is where you grew up?" Bradley had asked, looking around my apartment with undisguised curiosity. "Just part-time," Tiffany quickly corrected. "My father's house is in Lakewood Heights." I pretended not to notice how she minimized our life together, or the way she steered Bradley away from the framed photos of us at state parks and community carnivals, the modest but joy-filled moments of her childhood with me. The proposal came 6 months after graduation. Bradley presented Tiffany with a diamond that cost more than my annual salary during a hot air balloon ride over Napa Valley. The video, professionally shot and edited, was all over her social media accounts within hours. "Mum," she'd squealed over the phone. "We're thinking June at the Grand Palmer Hotel. It's going to be magnificent." I was genuinely happy for her. Despite our differences, I wanted Tiffany to find love and build a fulfilling life. When she suggested we meet for brunch to discuss wedding plans, I felt a surge of hope that this milestone might bring us closer. That initial brunch was lovely. Tiffany was animated, sharing Pinterest boards and magazine clippings. I offered to make her veil, having taught myself sewing years ago, as another cost-saving measure. "That's so sweet, Mum," she'd said, patting my hand. "But we're going with a designer piece from Paris. Bradley's parents know someone." Still, I remained optimistic. When she asked if I'd help with the guest list from my side, I spent hours compiling names of family friends, former neighbors, and teachers who'd made a difference in her life. The next time we met Tiffany was different, more controlled, less effusive. She'd brought a binder thick with spreadsheets and timelines. "So the final budget is coming in at around 200,000, she said casually, as if discussing the weather. I nearly choked on my coffee. $200,000 for one day. "It's actually quite reasonable for a wedding of this caliber," she replied, using Richard's dismissive tone. "Daddy's covering half, of course." The implication hung in the air between us. Richard was paying half. The rest would come from, where Bradley's family, Tiffany herself. Or was she expecting her middle school teacher mother to somehow produce $100,000? "Tiffany," I said carefully, "you know my financial situation. I've set aside some money for your wedding, but nothing close to what you're talking about." Her face tightened. "How much exactly, Per?" "About 10,000, I answered honestly. It had taken me years to save that much, putting aside small amounts from each paycheck. She didn't even try to hide her disappointment. "That barely covers the flowers, Mum." Over the next several weeks, I watched my daughter transform from an excited bride-to-be into a person I barely recognized. Every conversation revolved around the wedding's escalating costs and elaborate details. The guest list ballooned from 100 to 300 people, most of whom I'd never met. The venue changed from the already extravagant Grand Palmer to the exclusive Belmont estate, adding tens of thousands to the budget. During a particularly tense dress shopping appointment, Tiffany dismissed a beautiful gown because it was only $3,000. "It looks cheap," she'd said, while the saleswoman tactfully pretended not to hear. "It's elegant and flattering," I'd countered. "And within the budget we discussed." "God, Mum, why are you always so focused on money?" she'd snapped. "This is my wedding day. I'm only doing this once." The comment stung, but not as much as what she said next. "Bradley's mum offered to cover the dress if you can't. She understands the importance of appearances." That night I cried in my car before driving home. When had my daughter become someone who valued appearances over authenticity, over family? The answer, of course, was during all those formative years with Richard, watching him judge people's worth by their bank accounts and social connections. As the wedding date approached, Tiffany became increasingly critical of my contributions and suggestions. My list of potential guests was cut to just 5 people. My offer to host a small bridal shower was declined because my apartment wasn't appropriate for entertaining Bradley's family. When I mentioned the difficulty of affording the mother of the bride dress she'd selected from an upscale boutique, she suggested I figure it out, because everyone will be looking at us. The breaking point came during a weekend when Tiffany and Bradley visited to discuss the rehearsal dinner. Bradley had stepped out to take a business call when Tiffany noticed my Mustang parked in its usual spot. "You still have that old thing?" she'd asked, wrinkling her nose. "Of course," I replied. "It's running beautifully now. I've restored almost every part." She stared at the car thoughtfully, then turned to me with an expression I'd seen many times on Richard's face, calculating, assessing the value of something or someone. "You know," she said slowly, "classic Mustangs in good condition can sell for quite a lot these days. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I'm not selling Dad's car, Tiffany. Just think about it, she pressed. You never drive it anywhere important. It just sits here most of the time. That money could go toward the wedding. Before I could respond, Bradley returned, and Tiffany dropped the subject. But I could see an idea had taken root in her mind, and I dreaded its inevitable return. A week later, Tiffany suggested meeting for coffee, just the two of us, at an artisanal cafe downtown. I arrived to find her already seated at a corner table, scrolling through her phone. She'd dressed immaculately as always, another trait she'd inherited from Richard, who believed appearances were everything. "Mom," she began after perfunctory greetings, "we need to discuss a solution to our budget issue." Our budget issue. As if her decision to have a wedding that cost more than my house was somehow a shared problem. "I've been thinking about this all week," she continued, sliding her tablet across the table. On the screen was a web page for a classic car auction company. "Look at these prices for vintage Mustangs. Yours could easily bring in $50,000 to $60,000. That would make a huge difference for the wedding." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. The casual way she suggested I sell the one possession that meant everything to me, not just a car, but my father's legacy, my reclaimed identity, years of my own labor and love, was breathtaking. "Tiffany, that car was your grandfather's pride and joy. He left it to me when he died. I spent 3 years restoring it piece by piece." She waved her hand dismissively. "And now it's restored so you'd get top dollar. It's perfect timing." "I'm not selling the Mustang," I said firmly. "Not for a wedding, not for anything." Her expression hardened. "It's just a car, Mum. My wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. I understand that, and I've offered what I can afford. $10,000 is significant for me." "It's nothing in terms of what this wedding costs," she countered. "Daddy's contributing $100,000. Bradley's parents are covering the honeymoon and rehearsal dinner. Even my co-workers pitched in for the bridal shower. And you, my own mother, won't make one meaningful sacrifice." The unfairness of her statement took my breath away. I'd sacrificed everything for Tiffany her entire life. My dreams, my financial security, my happiness. I'd worked multiple jobs to provide for her while Richard lived in luxury. I'd never missed a school event, never prioritized myself above her needs. "I've offered alternatives," I reminded her. "We could simplify some elements of the wedding. I could take out a small loan to contribute more." "This wedding has been planned down to the last detail," Tiffany insisted. "Everything is booked and paid for. The only question is whether you're going to help cover your share or force me and Bradley to go into debt, right as we start our life together." "That's not a fair characterization, and you know it," I said, keeping my voice steady despite my growing anger. "This isn't about me refusing to help. It's about you demanding I sell something irreplaceable to fund extravagances you don't need." "If you really loved me," she said, deploying the ultimate emotional weapon, "you wouldn't hesitate. It's a car versus your only daughter's happiness." In that moment, I saw Richard so clearly in her. The manipulation, the false equivalencies, the disregard for others' feelings when they conflicted with his desires. It broke my heart, but it also strengthened my resolve. "Tiffany, I love you more than anything in this world, but I won't sell my father's car. I'm sorry." Her face contorted with anger. "Then I guess we know where your priorities lie. With a pile of metal and memories of a man who's been dead for 20 years, rather than with your living, breathing daughter." She stood abruptly, gathering her designer purse and tablet. "Figure out another way to contribute your share, or don't bother coming to the wedding. I won't have you there making Bradley's family think I come from people who don't understand proper celebrations." With that parting shot, she stormed out, leaving me stunned and heartbroken in the busy cafe. Over the next few days, My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Tiffany, each more manipulative than the last. I've told everyone my mother is helping with the wedding. Don't make me a liar. Bradley's mother can't believe you're being so selfish. Daddy says this is typical of you, putting your own wants above family. I responded calmly each time, reiterating that I loved her and wanted to help within my means, but would not sell the Mustang. I suggested we meet again to discuss realistic alternatives. Her final text was devastating in its finality. Since you care more about a stupid car than your only daughter, don't bother coming to my wedding. I'll tell everyone you're ill. It's better than admitting the truth, that you're too selfish to be a real mother. Minutes later, I discovered she'd blocked me on every platform: phone, email, social media. Just like that, I was excised from her life. That night, my colleague Sarah came over after I called her in tears. You did the right thing, she assured me, pouring tea at my kitchen table. Setting a boundary isn't selfish. Demanding someone sacrifice something precious to them for your wants, that's selfish. But what if she never speaks to me again? I asked, voicing my deepest fear. Sarah squeezed my hand. If your relationship can be permanently ended because you wouldn't sell your car, then the problem isn't the car. The problem is much deeper. I knew she was right, but that knowledge didn't ease the pain of my daughter's rejection, or the fear that Richard had finally won, had finally turned Tiffany completely against me. The 2 weeks following Tiffany's ultimatum were some of the darkest days I'd experienced since the divorce. I moved through my teaching duties on autopilot, forcing smiles for my students while feeling hollow inside. Nights were the worst, lying awake wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, if sacrificing the car would have been worth keeping my daughter in my life. My friend Grace, who'd known me since before Richard, became my lifeline during this time. Unlike my other friends who suggested I just sell the car to keep the peace, Grace understood what was really at stake. This isn't about the Mustang, she said during one of our long phone calls. It's about Richard winning, about Tiffany learning she can manipulate you just like he did. If you give in now, where does it end? I knew she was right. The car represented more than metal and mechanics. It represented my autonomy, my right to have something that mattered to me, my refusal to be controlled through guilt and emotional blackmail anymore. Still, the pain of Tiffany's silence was excruciating. I found myself driving past Richard's house, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. I wrote emails I never sent. I looked at her wedding registry online and cried over the extravagant items, $500 crystal vases and $1,000 sheet sets, that represented a lifestyle so far removed from the values I'd tried to instill. Then, 16 days after she'd blocked me, a text appeared on my phone. Mom, I miss you. I've been thinking a lot about our fight. Can we have dinner tomorrow to talk things through, just you and me? The Riverside Grill at 7 p.m. I really want to fix this before the wedding. My heart soared with hope and relief. She wanted reconciliation. Despite my joy, I approached the invitation with cautious optimism. I called Grace immediately. That's wonderful news, she said, though I detected a note of reservation in her voice. Just go in with clear boundaries. Okay? Listen to what she has to say, but don't agree to anything on the spot. I spent the next day in a flutter of nervous anticipation. I bought a small peace offering, a vintage brooch I'd found that would complement her wedding attire. I rehearsed what I would say, focusing on my love for her while maintaining my boundary about the car. That evening, I took extra care with my appearance. I wore a flattering dress I'd splurged on for special occasions, styled my hair, applied makeup carefully. As a final touch, I drove the Mustang to the restaurant, a gentle reminder of what it meant to me, but also perhaps an olive branch. See, I was saying I've brought the car to this important moment. It's part of our story, not something that should divide us. The Riverside Grill was one of the most exclusive restaurants in town, far beyond my usual budget, but a place Richard frequented with clients. As I handed my keys to the valet, I noticed him admiring the Mustang. "Beautiful restoration," he commented. "You don't see many this pristine." I thanked him, feeling a small surge of pride. Inside, the maitre d' checked his reservation list. "Ah, yes, the private dining room. This way, please." Private dining room. That seemed odd for a mother-daughter reconciliation, but perhaps Tiffany wanted privacy for what might be an emotional conversation. As I followed him through the main dining area, I rehearsed my opening words one last time. I'd start with how much I loved her, how I wanted to be part of her special day, how we could find a solution together. The maitre d' opened the door to the private room, and all my prepared words evaporated instantly. Sitting at the table was not just Tiffany, but Richard, still handsome at 60, still radiating that cold confidence I remembered so well. Beside him sat a stern-looking man in an expensive suit, whom I recognized as James Littleton Richards' longtime attorney. Across from them was a woman I didn't know, also in professional attire, with a portfolio open in front of her. Tiffany, dressed impeccably, as always, didn't stand to greet me. Her expression wasn't warm or conciliatory, it was coolly triumphant. "Mum," she said flatly, "thank you for coming." Richard gave me that smile I knew too well, the one that never reached his eyes. "Lorraine, you're looking well. Please sit down." I remained standing, shock, giving way to a dawning understanding. "What is this?" "This is an opportunity to resolve things amicably," Richard answered smoothly. "Tiffany told us about your disagreement regarding wedding finances." "And you are?" I asked the unknown woman. "Patricia Downing, financial consultant," she replied. "I specialize in asset liquidation and valuation." My gaze returned to Tiffany, looking for any sign of the daughter I'd raised, any hint of shame for this ambush. There was none. "You lied to get me here." She didn't deny it. "You weren't being reasonable. We needed to create a situation where you would listen." Listen to what exactly? Though I already knew. The attorney James slid a folder across the table toward me. "We've taken the liberty of preparing the necessary paperwork to transfer ownership of the vehicle in question. Ms. Downing has arranged for a buyer who's prepared to offer $65,000, well above market value for a Mustang of that year and condition." I felt physically ill. They had planned this meticulously, the private room to prevent a scene, the attorney, the prearranged buyer. How long had they been working on this scheme? Had Tiffany's initial demand for me to sell the car been spontaneous, or had Richard put her up to it from the beginning? "This is beyond inappropriate," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Tiffany, you invited me here under false pretenses, claiming you wanted reconciliation." "I do want reconciliation," she replied. "Once you sign these papers and do your part for the wedding, everything can go back to normal." Richard leaned forward. "Be reasonable, Lorraine. It's what's best for Tiffany. You've always been sentimental about impractical things. It's just a car." "Just a car?" I repeated the phrase, igniting something in me. "Like it was just a house you pushed me out of, just custody. You manipulated, just a life you destroyed." "Ancient history," Richard dismissed with a wave. "We're here about Tiffany's future." "No," I corrected, finding my voice growing stronger. "We're here because you've taught our daughter that emotional manipulation is how you get what you want. That people who love you should sacrifice everything while you sacrifice nothing." Tiffany's face flushed with anger. "That's not fair. Daddy has given me everything." "Everything except the understanding of what really matters," I replied sadly. the ability to value relationships over possessions. Ms. Downing cleared her throat. Perhaps we could focus on the matter at hand. The offer won't remain open indefinitely. I looked at each of them, Richard smug and controlling as ever, the professionals he'd hired to intimidate me, and finally Tiffany, my beautiful daughter, who had become a stranger before my eyes. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The fear and pain I'd carried for decades crystallized into clarity and resolve. No, I said simply. No what? Richard demanded. No to all of this. No to the sale. No to the manipulation. No to being ambushed and pressured. I turned directly to Tiffany. And no to teaching you that this behavior is acceptable or effective. You're being selfish, she accused, tears of frustration forming in her eyes. This is my wedding. And it's my life, I replied calmly. A life I've spent trying to show you what love really means. Not control, not materialism, but respect and support. I've clearly failed in that, and I'm sorry. I picked up my purse, leaving the untouched paperwork on the table. When you're ready to have an honest conversation without lawyers and ambushes, I'll be there. Until then, I wish you and Bradley happiness. If you walk out now, Tiffany threatened, don't expect an invitation to the wedding. The words hurt, but I didn't let it show. If my presence at your wedding is conditional on selling my car, then perhaps it's better I'm not there. It wouldn't be a celebration of love, but of submission. And that's not something I can celebrate. Richard stood. Always the drama queen Lorraine. This is why our marriage failed. I looked at him with pity rather than the anger he expected. Our marriage failed because you wanted ownership, not partnership. I see now that you've taught Tiffany the same. That's my greatest regret. With that, I walked out of the private dining room through the restaurant and into the warm evening air. The valet brought my Mustang around, and I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the familiar steering wheel like a lifeline. Only when I was safely on the road, the engine's comforting rumble surrounding me, did I allow the tears to fall. I drove aimlessly for hours, processing the magnitude of what had just happened and what it meant for my relationship with my daughter. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, it was past midnight. I called Grace despite the late hour, knowing she'd want to hear what happened. "They did what?" she exclaimed after I recounted the ambush. That's unbelievable." "Believe it," I said wearily. "Richard's influence runs deep. What will you do now?" It was the question I'd been asking myself during those hours of driving. Set better boundaries. Find a way forward that doesn't include being manipulated, and hope that someday Tiffany realizes what really matters. "I'm proud of you," Grace said. It took courage to walk away. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by modest possessions and priceless memories. For the first time since the divorce, I felt truly free of Richard's influence. I couldn't control what Tiffany had learned from him or the choices she would make. I could only control my own actions and responses. And I had chosen finally to value myself. The fallout from the restaurant confrontation was swift and far-reaching. Within days, mutual acquaintances began reaching out with concerns and confusion. "Tiffany's saying you refused to help with the wedding at all," said my cousin Eleanor, who had remained close to both of us over the years. "That you chose a car over her happiness." "That's not accurate," I replied, carefully explaining the real situation without vilifying Tiffany. Other calls followed, from former neighbors, from parents of Tiffany's childhood friends, even from a couple of my colleagues who had received wedding invitations. In each case, Tiffany had apparently shared her distorted version of events. According to her narrative, I was a selfish mother, refusing to make a small sacrifice for my only daughter's special day. Richard, meanwhile, employed more direct tactics. A week after the restaurant incident, I received a call from a man who had served on the school board when I was first hired. Lorraine, I ran into Richard Wainwright at the club yesterday, he began awkwardly. He mentioned you're having some difficulties regarding Tiffany's wedding. Did he? I kept my tone neutral. He suggested that perhaps the school community could help reason with you. Something about a car. I thanked him for his concern, but assured him the situation was a private family matter. After hanging up, I sat in stunned disbelief. Richard was actually trying to pressure me through professional connections. This realization prompted me to seek legal advice of my own. The attorney I consulted, a no-nonsense woman named Meredith Klein, listened to my story with growing indignation. First of all, she said, make sure your car is securely stored. I wouldn't put it past them to try something underhanded. That same day, I arranged to move the Mustang to a friend's locked garage across town. The precaution felt extreme, but Richard's determination to get his way had always been boundless. Second, Meredith continued, document everything. Every text, email, phone call. If they escalate this harassment, we may need evidence. I created a detailed timeline of events, saving screenshots of messages and recording names and dates of everyone who contacted me about the situation. It felt surreal to be taking such measures against my own daughter, but Meredith's concern about escalation proved prescient. 3 days later, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. It was after dinner, and I was grading papers when the doorbell rang. Standing on my doorstep was Bradley Tiffany's fiancé. Mrs. Thompson, he began formally. I apologize for coming unannounced. I invited him in, curious and wary. Bradley had always been polite but distant in our few interactions, clearly taking his cues from Tiffany regarding how to treat me. I wanted to talk to you directly, he said, declining my offer of tea. About the situation with the wedding and everything. His discomfort was obvious, but there was something else in his expression. Concern, perhaps even distress. Tiffany doesn't know I'm here, he continued. She'd be furious if she found out. But I feel like I'm watching something spiral out of control, and I need to understand what's really happening. Over the next hour, Bradley painted a disturbing picture of what had been occurring behind the scenes. Richard had been far more involved in the wedding planning than I'd realized, encouraging Tiffany's most extravagant ideas and dismissing Bradley's occasional suggestions for moderation. It started with the venue, Bradley explained. We had chosen the Grand Palmer, which is already extremely high-end, but Richard kept mentioning that the Belmont would make a statement. When Tiffany mentioned the additional cost, he just said, "Your mother will contribute. It's the least she can do after everything." I felt a chill at these words. Richard had been setting me up from the beginning, positioning me as the solution to financial problems he was actively encouraging. Then came the car issue, Bradley continued. Tiffany mentioned casually that you had a classic car that could be worth a lot. Richard immediately latched onto the idea, talking about how selfish it would be if you refused. "And what did you think?" I asked carefully. Bradley looked genuinely troubled. "Honestly, I thought it was inappropriate to even ask. It's your property, your family heirloom. No one should pressure you to sell something so personal." His honesty surprised me. "Have you shared these thoughts with Tiffany?" "I've tried," he sighed. "But whenever I suggest scaling back or question Richard's involvement, she gets defensive. Says I don't understand what a proper society wedding should be." "That sounds like Richard talking," I observed. "It is," Bradley agreed. "Word for word sometimes." He went on to reveal that Tiffany had been hiding financial realities from me. While Richard had indeed pledged $100,000, 50,000 of that was actually a loan Tiffany would need to repay. Bradley's parents had already contributed more than their agreed amount, but were growing concerned about the escalating costs and Tiffany's increasingly demanding behavior. "We're starting our marriage with nearly 80,000 in debt," Bradley admitted, running a hand through his hair. "All for one day. It doesn't make sense." "Does Tiffany understand the implications of this debt?" "I don't think so. Richard has convinced her that appearances matter above all else, that impressing his colleagues and friends is an investment in our future. But the way she's burning bridges with you with my parents, I'm worried." Before leaving, Bradley shared one final disturbing piece of information. "The lawyers at that dinner, Richard paid them. The so-called buyer for your car, a business associate of Richard's who owed him a favor. The whole thing was orchestrated to pressure you into selling." After Bradley left, I sat in stunned silence, processing everything he'd revealed. My heart ached for Tiffany, caught in Richard's web of materialism and manipulation. But I also felt a strange sense of validation. My instincts about Richard's involvement had been correct. The next morning, I took a personal day from school, my first in over 2 years. I needed space to think, to decide how to move forward with this new information. I drove to the garage where my Mustang was stored and spent hours working on small improvements, finding clarity in the familiar routine of mechanical work. By afternoon, I'd reached several decisions. I called Grace to share Bradley's visit and my thoughts. "I'm going to maintain my boundaries," I told her. "But I'm also going to make it clear to Tiffany that my love isn't dependent on her choices, even when I disagree with them." "Do you think she'll listen?" Grace asked skeptically. "Probably not immediately," I admitted. "But someday, when the fog of Richard's influence clears a bit, I want her to know there's a path back to me." I wrote Tiffany a letter, not an email easily deleted or a text easily dismissed, but a physical letter expressing my love, my concerns and my hope for reconciliation based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. I mailed it to her directly at her apartment, bypassing Richard's potential interference. Whether she would read it or immediately discard it, I couldn't know. But the act of writing it helped me clarify my own position. I would not be manipulated, but neither would I close the door on our relationship. The ball was in her court now. In the meantime, I would focus on rebuilding parts of myself that had been neglected during years of navigating Richard's manipulation and trying to maintain a relationship with Tiffany on her terms. I joined a classic car club that met monthly at a local auto shop, finding community among fellow enthusiasts who appreciated the Mustang for what it represented. Not just monetary value, but heritage craftsmanship and personal accomplishment. For the first time in decades, I began to envision a future defined by my own choices rather than reactions to Richard's schemes or Tiffany's needs. It was terrifying but also exhilarating, like driving a newly restored car on an open road, uncertain of the destination, but enjoying the journey. 6 months passed without direct contact from Tiffany. The wedding date came and went. I learned through mutual acquaintances that it had been postponed due to venue issues, though Bradley had hinted in a brief text that he'd insisted on scaling back the extravagance, causing conflict with both Tiffany and Richard. During this time, my life transformed in unexpected ways. The classic car club became a central part of my social circle. These men and women, who shared my appreciation for automotive history and craftsmanship, accepted me without question. Many were around my age with similar stories of rebuilding themselves along with their vehicles after difficult life transitions. Through the club, I discovered a community program teaching basic car maintenance to disadvantaged youth. I began volunteering on Saturday mornings, showing teenagers how to change oil, replace filters, and diagnose common problems. Watching their confidence grow as they mastered these skills reminded me of my own journey with my father in his garage. My Mustang, once a private source of joy and healing, became something more. At the club's suggestion, I entered it in a regional classic car show, where it won an award for Most Authentic Restoration. The trophy wasn't what mattered. It was the recognition of years of patient work, of believing something broken could be made whole again. It was at this car show that I unexpectedly ran into Bradley. He was wandering among the displayed vehicles alone, hands in his pockets, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, spotting me near my car. "This is yours. It's incredible." We talked for nearly an hour, sitting on a bench away from the crowds. He and Tiffany had broken their engagement 2 months earlier, a decision he described as painful but necessary. "The wedding planning exposed fundamental differences in our values," he explained. "When I insisted on reducing costs and suggested a more intimate celebration, Tiffany accused me of embarrassing her in front of her father's circle. The final breaking point came when Bradley discovered Tiffany had opened credit cards in both their names, without his knowledge charging thousands for wedding expenses beyond their agreed budget. It wasn't just about money, he clarified. It was about trust, about partnership, about how we approached major decisions. I realized we wanted very different things from marriage. I expressed my sympathy, genuinely sorry for his pain, despite my private relief that he had recognized the unhealthy patterns before legal ties were established. "Have you heard from her?" he asked tentatively. "No," I admitted, "but I left the door open for when she's ready." "She's struggling," Bradley said after a moment. "Richard's disappointed about the cancelled wedding. Apparently he'd arranged for several important business contacts to attend. He's been less supportive since the engagement ended." This news concerned me. For all her faults, Tiffany was still my daughter. The thought of her facing Richard's disappointment without emotional support worried me. A week later, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, there was a long pause before I heard a voice I'd know anywhere. "Mom." Tiffany sounded smaller somehow, her usual confidence absent. "Tiffany." I breathed, heart racing. "I'm so glad to hear from you." Another pause. "I got your letter, the one you sent months ago." "I'm glad." "I didn't read it until recently," she admitted. "I was too angry before." We talked for nearly 20 minutes, a cautious, halting conversation full of long silences and careful words. She didn't apologize for the restaurant ambush or the wedding demands, but neither did she make new accusations or demands. It was a neutral exchange, but it was contact, the first crack in the wall between us. Before hanging up, she asked hesitantly, "Could we maybe get coffee sometime, just to talk?" I suggested a casual cafe near my apartment, deliberately choosing a place unconnected to Richard or our previous conflicts. She agreed to meet the following week. I approached this meeting with cautious hope, sharing my plans with Grace, who offered sensible advice. Listen more than you speak. Don't expect too much from one conversation. Set clear boundaries from the start. When the day arrived, I arrived early, securing a quiet table in the corner. Tiffany walked in 10 minutes late, looking both familiar and changed. Her designer clothes and perfect makeup were the same, but something in her posture and expression was different, less certain, more vulnerable. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I'll always show up for you, Tiffany," I replied. That hasn't changed. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd had before. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, Tiffany spoke to me without Richard's influence coloring her words. She talked about the broken engagement, about her father's reaction, about the embarrassment of cancelling a wedding that had been so extensively planned. "Daddy was furious," she admitted. "Not because I was hurt, but because of how it looked to his friends. He kept saying I'd ruined months of networking opportunities." As she spoke, I began to see the cracks in Richard's facade from her perspective. How his support had always been conditional, how quickly his affection turned to criticism when she failed to meet his expectations. The worst part, she continued, staring into her coffee, is that I'm starting to see the same patterns in how I treated you. The demands, the guilt, the focus on appearances over feelings. This acknowledgement, however tentative, was more than I'd dared hope for. We learn what we live, I said gently. Your father modeled certain behaviors, and they became normal to you. That doesn't excuse how I treated you, she countered, especially about the car. I knew what it meant to you about Grandpa and everything. I wanted the wedding Daddy thought I should have more than I cared about your feelings. We talked for over 2 hours, covering ground we'd never explored before. Tiffany's fear of disappointing Richard, my struggles during the years after the divorce, the ways we'd both adapted to survive his manipulations, sometimes at the cost of our relationship with each other. Before we parted, I suggested something I'd been considering since Bradley mentioned her struggles. Would you consider talking to someone professional? A counselor who specializes in family dynamics? To my surprise, she nodded. I've actually started already. 3 sessions so far. It was Bradley's parting suggestion, and probably the most valuable thing he gave me. We agreed to move forward slowly, meeting for coffee or lunch every few weeks, without pressure or expectations. I made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time, and that certain boundaries, including the Mustang issue, were non-negotiable. I understand, she said. I don't expect you to forget everything that happened. I just hope eventually you can forgive me. I'm already working on that, I assured her. Forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the past. It means creating space for a different future. Over the following months, our cautious reconnection continued. There were difficult moments, times when Richard's influence resurfaced in Tiffany's words, or when old hurts flared unexpectedly. But there was progress too. Tiffany began to recognize manipulation tactics, both those she'd learned from Richard and those he continued to employ against both of us. Richard, predictably, was displeased by our reconciliation. He made several attempts to interfere from scheduling emergency father-daughter dinners that conflicted with our plans, to making disparaging comments about me during his conversations with Tiffany. But his influence was waning as she developed the tools to recognize and resist his tactics. Around this time, my involvement with the youth automotive program deepened. What began as weekend volunteering expanded into a structured after-school program, with me developing a curriculum that combined practical skills with career exploration. Several of my students secured apprenticeships at local garages, while others pursued further education in automotive technology. The Mustang became a teaching tool, a symbol not just of my personal journey, but of possibilities for these young people. When they admired the car's restoration, I showed them photos of how it looked when I began, rusted, damaged, seemingly beyond repair. Nothing's unfixable, though, I told them. It just takes time, knowledge, and patience. This philosophy applied equally to my relationship with Tiffany. It wasn't unfixable, just damaged. And with time, knowledge, and patience, we were gradually restoring what had been broken. By the 1-year anniversary of our coffee shop reunion, Tiffany had made remarkable progress. Through therapy and difficult self-examination, she began to untangle the harmful patterns she'd absorbed from Richard. She moved to a smaller apartment, took a job based on personal fulfillment rather than status, and even started setting boundaries with Richard, a process that caused tremendous conflict, but ultimately strengthened her sense of self. On a warm Sunday afternoon, she asked if she could see the Mustang again. We met at the garage, where I now kept it surrounded by other classic cars belonging to club members. It's even more beautiful than I remembered, she said, running her hand along the gleaming red finish. I can't believe I ever asked you to sell it. Want to go for a drive? I offered. Her face lit up. Really? We spent the afternoon cruising along coastal roads, windows down, playing the same Motown classics my father and I had enjoyed decades earlier. At one point, Tiffany looked over at me, wind whipping her hair, and said, "I get it now. This isn't just a car. It's freedom. It's history. It's you." I smiled, feeling something long broken finally click back into place between us. "Want to learn how to drive it?" Her eyes widened. "You'd let me?" "Not today." I laughed. "But someday when you're ready, it's part of your heritage too." As we drove back to the garage at sunset, Tiffany said something that touched me deeply. "Thank you for not giving in, Mum. If you had sold this car when I demanded it, I would never have learned that some things can't be bought or manipulated. I would never have questioned Daddy's values. I would have just kept becoming more like him." "Sometimes love means holding firm," I replied, "even when it hurts." "I'm beginning to understand that," she said quietly. The journey of healing between Tiffany and me continues to this day. There are still moments of tension, still echoes of old patterns that need to be recognized and addressed. Richard remains a complicating factor, though his influence diminishes as Tiffany strengthens her own identity. But there is also joy, connection, and a deeper understanding between us than we've ever had before. We're building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation or control. We're learning to love each other as we truly are, not as we wish the other would be. As for the Mustang, it remains my most treasured possession, not for its monetary value, but for all it represents: my father's love, my own resilience, my refusal to be manipulated, and now a bridge to healing with my daughter. If you're facing a similar situation, pressure to sacrifice something meaningful to appease others, manipulation disguised as love, difficult boundaries with family members, know that standing firm isn't selfish. It's sometimes the most loving choice you can make, not just for yourself, but for the other person too. Has anyone else experienced family pressure to give up something meaningful to you? Share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and healing, and share with someone who might need to hear this message today. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. And remember, boundaries are an act of love.